Signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità dall'Accademia Britannica. Accogliervi qui stasera ci fa il più pieno piacere. It's a pleasure, a privilege and a joy for me to introduce Dr. Catherine Fletcher to deliver tonight's lecture. It's a great personal satisfaction as well as an institutional honour to welcome Catherine back to the British School at Rome. When I was a Rome Scholar in 2009, Catherine had the adjacent room as Rome Fellow, and it's, I must say, humbling to see the many accomplishments, remarkable accomplishments, that she's achieved since we were fellow award holders way back when. Catherine is currently Associate Professor at Swansea University. It's a post that she's held since 2015. She's held a number of teaching offices, including Durham and Sheffield universities, and has been a worthy recipient of a spread of prestigious fellowships, including Institute for Historical Research, European University Institute, and in 2015 won incredibly exciting award as AHRC BBC New Generation Thinker. But of course, the most glittering award of all was that Rome Fellowship here at the British School at Rome. Not only has Catherine published very widely on the history of diplomacy, material culture, and political life in the early modern period, with a special focus on Italy, but also all of these works have had a remarkable impact. And I often look to Catherine as a barometer for what the next big thing will be. Her recent monographs include Our Man in Rome, Henry VIII and his Italian Diplomat, published in 2012, and Diplomacy in Renaissance Rome, published with Cambridge University Press in 2015. And at the centre of tonight's talk, set in the context of the thrilling, bloody Shakespearean story of Renaissance Florence, a world of vendetta and betrayal, of espionage and assassination, and more than a little illicit sex, her wonderful new biography of Alessandro Medici, the so-called Moor of Florence, great-grandson of Lorenzo, and said to be the illegitimate son of an African slave. Hilary Mantel, who else, has said that there is nothing in 16th century history is more astonishing than the career of Alessandro de' Medici. Published with Penguin, The Black Prince of Florence was declared as Evening Standard Book of the Year of 2016, a fact which Catherine modestly brushes off by saying, well, at least it gives my mother something to show off about. But this seminal work has raised a number of challenging questions, contributing to the discourse in very, very fruitful ways, not least the history of attitudes to race, how to interpret ethnicity in the 16th century, a society without modern concepts of race that's so shaped by racist pseudoscience and categorization of the Victorian era, and how to problematize the notion of Renaissance Florence as the cradle of Western civilization that flows neatly forward into the Enlightenment and up to the present day. Tonight, drawing on her expertise of writing this biography of Alessandro de' Medici, Catherine will explore the depiction of the Medici family in Rai Uno's current television series, which is smashing visitor rating records in Italy at the moment. And this is an investigation which addresses an issue that occupies so many of us, and that is the presentation of the past to the public. There can be no one better equipped to tackle this issue than Catherine. In addition to her contributions to history, Catherine also has background in media and political and communication studies, and has appeared widely on television and radio shows, was a historical expert advisor on BBC's Wolf Hall series, and the ultimate indicator as to whether or not you made it as an academic appeared on In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg. Enough from me. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Catherine, or introduced more simply, a lecture by Fletcher.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be back here at the BSR, and a pleasure to see so many people here this evening interested in thinking about the Medici on page and screen. I probably don't need to give you a whole load of introduction to the Medici. In fact, they are one of the best-known dynasties of Renaissance Italy, a family that made a fortune in trade and banking, patronised leading artists and philosophers, and then, not without some considerable trouble and resistance, established themselves as Dukes of Florence in the 1530s and then Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Their legacy made in large part by the decision of the last of the line to endow the city of Florence with their astonishing art collections and forbid their sale. Now, the Medici are what I think in publishing and film and TV terms one might call a brand. In fact, as a child, I first came across the name Medici as a brand of birthday and greetings cards that is widely sold in the United Kingdom. For over 100 years, this particular company has been producing beautiful fine art cards under the brand of Medici. But alongside this reputation for art, the Medici have always had something of a darker history. The darker history, the political manoeuvrings through which they built up their political power to become absolute rulers. Now, in this evening's lecture, I want not so much to talk about the specifics of the ins and outs of that history. That is not something I can fit into an hour, although I will do some of it, but to think about how the Medici family has been rewritten for audiences in the late 20th and 21st centuries. I'm going to discuss how history works in the present and its relationship to drama and fiction. And these are my 4 case studies. I'll talk about my own book. I'll talk about Medici Masters of Florence. I will talk about season 3 of Hannibal, which you may not know has a large plot riff on the Patsy conspiracy of 1478. And I will talk about Memoirs of a Gnostic Dwarf, a relatively obscure book from the 1990s, which nonetheless was rather important for me personally in engaging me as a reader of fiction with this period of history before I studied it at university. However, before we get into this wonderful world of rifts and plays and remaking of the past, I want to tell you a little bit about the real-life events that lie behind them. Florence, in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, was a city of merchants. They most excel in trade, wrote Pope Pius II, who you see there on the left, which philosophers think sordid. Pius came from the rival city of Siena, and he generally wasn't very nice about the Florentines. But it's true, it was a mercantile city. The wealth of the Medici family was based on the wool trade, but most importantly, on banking. And by the beginning of the 15th century, they had become one of the leading families in Florence. In 1421, Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici, who you see on the right here, became gonfaloniere, literally the standard bearer of the Republic, holder of one of the most prestigious offices in the city. He was also a banker to the popes in Rome, and his bank has been called the most successful commercial enterprise in Italy. It was the basis for his son, Cosimo the Elder's, rise to power. Now, these 15th century Medici did not rule Florence by dynastic right. They exercised their authority as a family that were among the city's leading oligarchs. Florence was controlled by a series of elected committees. Any member of the city's 21 guilds who was aged 30 or over was eligible to hold office. And office holders typically served for very short terms, a couple of months at a time. This was not a situation where Cosmo here would go on and, hold elected office for an extended period. This system of election excluded two types of men. It excluded ordinary people, such as day labourers who weren't eligible to belong to the guilds. It also excluded some of the old noble families of Florence. So 3/4 of the population had no political rights at all. Women were not involved in this political system openly, a question to which I'll return when I talk about the fictional depictions. But in practice, a handful of families, linked through ties of friendship and marriage, could effectively manipulate the elections in the Florentine system. In political and military emergencies, and increasingly under the 60-year rule, when the Medici were essentially exercising power, a system of pre-selection of candidates allowed the family further control. So what happens in the real history of 15th century Florence is that the Medici build their power, accumulate their power through their networks with other families and through working within the political system. This is not, might be kind of less exciting than the TV image of murdering your way to the top, but largely they're political operators rather than working kind of outside of the political system. The Medici, nonetheless, made good use of the rhetoric of republicanism, but as Pope Pius II again put it, Cosimo here was king in everything but name, although he conceded that he was more cultured than merchants usually are. Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo, nicknamed the Magnificent, accrued astonishing power alongside his patronage of art and letters, so much so that Francesco Guicciardini, 16th century Florentine historian and politician, wrote that if Florence was to have a tyrant, she could never have found a better or more delightful one. So delightful tyranny is the way that he summed up the way that Florentine politics worked at this time. Now, this is a family tree of the Medici, which you see is rather complex, so I'm not going to go through who they all are there. I'm just going to summarise, so we can see where the texts fit in, some of the main lines. So we have Cosimo the Elder at the top, followed by his son Piero the Gouty. So these are people who you are seeing at the moment in Medici Masters of Florence. Piero's son is Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Lorenzo is then followed by his first son, Piero, nicknamed the Unfortunate, who loses power in Florence, Giovanni de' Medici, who's another son, Pope Leo X, and a cousin, the cousin of Lorenzo, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano, who becomes Pope Clement VII. The generation after that, we have Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and finally, at the bottom, the last of the people really in the kind of Republican period of the Medici before they become dukes, is Alessandro, who's the first Duke of Florence. So 5 generations really over the course of a century that these texts I'm going to discuss spread across from Medici Masters of Florence in a very early period, Hannibal, which riffs on 1478 conspiracy against Lorenzo, the Gnostic Dwarf, which is all about Pope Leo X, and then my book, which is about Alessandro. Now, there is a very long history of popular accounts of the Medici family. William Roscoe wrote a biography of Lorenzo the Magnificent in the 18th century. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, who we see here, ruled in the 16th century, has had numerous biographies over the years. And the early Medici, those of the 15th century, proved a very popular topic for popular history in the 19th century, in part because they were merchant princes and philanthropists, not princes and kings, and the 15th century Medici could be a model for modern 19th century men who had made a lot of money in business and wanted to know what to do with it. Indeed, one scholar of Renaissance Italy, Anthony Mongeau, has argued that the modern image of the Italian Renaissance was in large part made by these people in the USA. This was also a Renaissance, though, of the 15th century. The Medici who came afterwards, the ones who are kings and princes and queens like Catherine, tend in popular culture, have been for a very long time, have been the villains of the piece. So Catherine here, you will see in a number of texts as a poisoning schemer. Alessandro is also typically the bad guy in fiction. Here he is being assassinated by Lauren Xenas, also known as Lorenzaccio, Bad Lorenzo, whose apology or justification of the murder made him famous. And in fact, this story, the story of the murder, is told repeatedly from Jacobean revenge drama through several stage plays in the 19th century, when his blow for Republican freedom, as he wrote it up, whether or not that was his actual motivation is a different question. This sort of blow for Republican freedom, assassinating the Medici tyrant, found a lot of favour in France, particularly of the 19th century. I don't have time to go into it here, but I would just note that it's rather ironic that one of the most famous Republican opponents of the Medici, Niccolo Machiavelli, has also managed to become an abstracted villainous figure in popular culture. So you get numerous Machiavellian anti-heroes like this, in whose, bastardized and accurate quotation here, bad for the greater good, is clearly a spin on Machiavelli's thing that Machiavelli didn't say, that the end justifies the means. But we have the Medici portrayed all sorts of ways in popular culture. We have their opponents portrayed in different ways, generally as the bad guys. And I suppose I'm thinking about the question, why does this matter? Should it matter to people like me, who is a professional historian, working in a university, and also writing for the broader public? And part of the reason I think it does matter is because when my students come into class, this really is where they start. They start often, if I'm teaching Tudor history, history of 16th century England and Wales, they've seen the Tudors on TV. If I mention Catherine de' Medici, they've seen Reign, which is a drama about the youthful Mary Queen of Scots being a teenager at the court of Catherine de' Medici. They've seen the Borgias, and now they've seen Medici, Masters of Florence. And in order to engage with people, you've got to start from where they are and think about the kinds of myths and images that they have got in their heads. And I start to think, should I correct them on the accuracy all the time? Because this is the thing that I get asked most about historical drama. Is it accurate? I'm going to give you an example. It might surprise you, actually, that despite being a professional historian, I am more relaxed than many members of the public about details of accuracy in historical drama. Typically, if you speak to anybody who works professionally in TV, on historical TV programming, they will tell you that the thing that really gets the public going are minor errors in costume. For example, that regimental badge didn't exist until 1792, and you showed it in a shot in the 1780s. What an outrage. Now, to be honest, I mean, if I were a dress historian, I might be a little bit irritated by this, but in the big scheme of things on a historical level, I can live with some playing around. I do think, however, that if producers decide that they are going to take this approach of a sort of loose attitude to historical accuracy and just go and have fun in the Renaissance playground, they might sometimes, for their own dramatic purposes, gain by talking to historians about how things work. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that several people I have seen have picked up on in the new Raiuno programme on the Medici is the question of beards. Lots of the characters wear beards. This is historically inaccurate. The predominant look by far amongst the upper class of Renaissance Florence was clean-shaven. And you might say, how much does this matter? Well, it sort of matters because actually if you do that, you lose some dramatic possibilities. For example, here are famous before and after pictures of Pope Clement VII, before the sack of Rome when he is not wearing a beard, and after the sack of Rome of 1527 when he decides to wear a beard in order to demonstrate publicly his mourning for the city of Rome. Now, if you sort of have everybody wearing beards beforehand, you lose your dramatic opportunity to do something visually with that look. So I think it's a somewhat odd choice, but that's as much with a sort of writer's hat on as it is with a historian's. So I'm going to come back to some further thoughts on historical accuracy and does it matter. But what I want to do before that is to introduce a little bit of theory about historical film that is quite widely discussed. And that is a theory proposed by Robert Rosenstone in his book History on Film, Film on History. He has argued that historians need, in considering history on screen, to take a more subtle approach than simply saying, is it or is it not accurate? He made the point that for dramatic narrative, some inaccuracy is often necessary. Films have a limited length, and they need to do things in a particular narrative style, certainly so long as they're in the mainstream. Let me give you one example of how this happens in Medici Masters of Florence. This is Brian Cox's Guadagni, the Gonfaloniere figure. As I said earlier on, in real life, office holders in Renaissance Florence rotated every few months. Dramatically, however, you can imagine that this would be a bit of a nightmare if every 3 months further into the script you had to introduce a new character with a really clunky bit of exposition. Oh, you must be the person who for these 3 months is being the standard bearer of Florence. Yes, that's right, that's me. It clearly doesn't work on dramatic terms. So the compromise is something that is inaccurate to have one individual take this role throughout the series. And that is something that there is a logical, dramatic reason for doing. Rosenstone suggested that instead of thinking about is it accurate or is it not accurate, we think instead about whether the invention that is often done in historical drama is true or false invention. And by this he means, is the invention that the filmmaker's doing broadly consonant with what we know of the real history, or does it fly in the face of the historical facts as we know them? Now, this idea of consonant with the historical narrative or not has its problems, not least in cases where there is no consensus amongst historians about how to interpret events or concepts in the past. It's also not very helpful when you're dealing with self-conscious anachronism or the use of dramatic irony, which I think has become more common in historical filmmaking since Rosenstone was writing in the 1990s. But I think, although it's perhaps somewhat simplistic, it is a useful model to think about. And on this test, on Rosenstone's test, Medici Masters of Florence is very clearly at the false invention end of the scheme. It is, if I imagine a Hollywood 5-word pitch for it, it's essentially a historical version of a mafia thriller. And in fact, I mean, the creator Frank Spotnitz is very open about the fact that they have taken inspiration from The Godfather. He also cites Amadeus. I think the Godfather parallel is more apparent having watched the series for myself. This isn't the first time, in fact, that the Medici have been done with a mafia parallel. Indeed, way back, probably about 10 years ago, PBS and Channel 4 did a show called The Medici Godfathers of the Renaissance, to which I will return a little later. So the emphasis is on the significance of the family or clan, on internal rivalries within it, the story of competing families contending for power. We have a figure in the cast who plays the accountant. We have a thug, the henchman. Marco Bello is the guy like right on the left in the picture. It's also quite an old school mafia thriller, I would say, in its style. This is not The Sopranos, it's not Gomorrah, it's a relatively, it's a Godfather style mafia show. Now, this has not pleased everyone. It has, for example, attracted the ire of Medici descendant Ottaviano de' Medici di Toscana, who was pleased to announce on his Facebook page here in mid-December that the Regional Council of Tuscany had, on his initiative, passed a motion calling on UNESCO to list as intangible cultural heritage the true history of the Medici dynasty, so it could be protected from the ignoble and offensive falsehoods screened by Rye. So, if you're interested, you can go and read the whole of the Facebook discussion on these pages. It is absolutely really quite fascinating how much some people are really angry about this portrayal of the Medici, of this leading Florentine family as mafiosi in this show. However, audiences on the whole have not seemed to mind. I Medici here in Italy broke records with 30.6 million viewers and a 30% market share compared to Rai Uno's more usual 20.8%. One suspects the controversy has helped rather than hindered it, and certainly the critical reviews have not put off the fans. I will say, however, that this trope of the Medici as godfathers of the Renaissance has also had some heavier weight criticism. The 2004 PBS documentary I mentioned a moment ago, The Medici Godfathers of the Renaissance, has been critiqued by Christina Lung for its explicit parallel between the rise to power of the Medici and mafia families. And when this was broadcast in the US, it was criticised by historians, for a start, for being historically incorrect. It was also criticised by Italian-American community leaders who said, this is really a very stereotypical and inappropriate portrayal of Italians. It draws on quite offensive stereotypes of our community. And in that context, in the 2004 context, PBS, in the making of the documentary, actually ended up having to apologise for stereotyping Italian history in this way and suggesting that Italians were more or less all mafiosi, even the famous art patrons. I suspect I Medici, as an Italian co-production, it kind of gets away with that because Italians can say that about themselves if they like. It's not quite the same case as an American TV company coming in and putting the label onto other people. So, Medici Masters of Florence is pitched as a thriller. It's cavalier about historical accuracy. It is not only in terms of the beards, also in terms of the costumes. This is the civic dress, really, as I'm showing you in this image, the long red lucco of Renaissance Florence, not something we see very much in the series. There are all sorts of things one can pick up. It's really a drama that exists in what I was trying to find a name for it, and I came up with Renaissance land. An imagined Italian olden times set broadly between 1400 and 1550. In some ways quite a mystical setting, and it may not be an accident here that it shares a star with Game of Thrones. There is rather little of the Renaissance going on. And as I say, it's playing superbly well on a domestic level. Very showy in terms of production values, but I would say, watching it from a British point of view and comparing with TV of this genre internationally, it looks quite conservative. It's not particularly violent. the sexist soft focus. There's a game of historical football. They keep their shirts on. It's not the kind of sexed up version of history that one often sees in the more popular takes, like the Tudors, which has been on Showtime in the United States and so forth. And I was thinking about why this was and why the particular approach to dramatising history. And I think it has something to do with Rai Uno. Rai Uno, so people may know, if you go back a few decades in the history of Italian television, was traditionally the Christian Democrat channel. It was the conservative, politically a conservative channel. Still today, it is the channel you watch if you want to see the news about the Pope. And I suspect there is something of a tension between what is acceptable in prime time on Rai Uno and the expectations of an international TV audience. But that's only my speculation about the dilemmas that may be facing the producers. To come back to the question of accuracy, however, there are some occasions watching this programme where I think that compromises on historical accuracy raise some interesting ethical questions. These are not so much related to the history as to the impact of this history on TV viewers in the present day and on present-day political questions. Let me give you a few examples. First of all, it's apparent from the response of social media that audiences of Medici Masters of Florence have very much appreciated the strong female characters in the show. If you use Twitter, you may like to look up the hashtag Team Contessina, which is a hashtag of people who are basically fans of the character Contessina de' Bardi, wife of Cosimo. These strong female characters and the level of their engagement in political life really are quite anachronistic. Florentine political society, even by comparison to the political society in other Renaissance states, was very male. This is not to say that women in Renaissance Florence had no political agency, but I think that back some decades ago when Joan Kelly famously posed the question, did women have a Renaissance in relation to Florentine history, she was right to pose it. And the degree of constraint that faced women who may have been interested in being politically engaged in this society really is not apparent in the TV show. So, for example, there's a particular dramatic scene where Contessina de' Bardi rides her horse up the stairs into the signoria's meeting to plead for her husband and so on, which is, which is wrong. I mean, it's very dramatic, but it's just not historically possible, really. Now, you might argue that while unsubtle, this is a reasonable modern-day attempt to address a perennial problem in TV drama, which is the marginalisation of female characters. You may have heard of a thing called the Bechdel test, which is a test that has been invented to judge whether or not female characters in drama are getting a reasonable level of representation. So you could justify it on those grounds and say, look, this isn't exactly what went on historically, but we want to give, the female actors something to do. We want to make a story which is not all about men. However, doing that also succeeds in marginalising something else, specifically the importance of relationships between men in Renaissance Florence, including sexual relationships between men, which were extremely common. Anyone who's read Michael Rock's book, Forbidden Friendships, a groundbreaking book about homosexual society in this place and period, will know that in the later 15th century, the majority of local males, at least once in their lifetimes, were officially incriminated for engaging in homosexual relations. That is, the majority were caught. I mean, these are the people who were actually caught by the authorities. If you read Rock's study, the numbers are astonishing, to the point that the German slang for a sodomite in this period was a Florencer. And one of the things that I think about Florence in Medici is that it's quite anachronistically heterosexual. We've got the marriage of Cosimo and Contessina at its heart. Significant in Lorenzo's backstory is his lost love, Rosa. We do, to be fair, get one brief scene of Donatello in bed with a man, but the storyline doesn't really go anywhere, and essentially it functions for two reasons, I think. One, to establish Cosimo de' Medici as a nice bloke who doesn't give Donatello into trouble for sodomy, and also allows everybody on Twitter and social media to go, wow, Raiuno actually did gay sex, sort of. So I think my ethical worry here is less about how accurate all of this is, and more about a concern that when you have a society where there is widespread evidence of sexual relationships between men, that doesn't get erased out of its popular representation in a present-day context when discrimination against, and indeed in some countries outright persecution, of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people continues. So, you know, we're only in season 1. I hope that somewhere down the line the producers might realise that their historical setting in fact gives them many legitimate opportunities to show same-sex relationships, and if they have to argue about this with the commissioners of their programme, then actually the extensive historical research on the topic gives them very good grounds for doing so. I have similar present-day ethical issues with the way the show has dealt with the question of slave ownership. The woman who you see on the right here, Madalena, who's Cosimo's mistress, was in real life an enslaved woman from Circassia. In the show, she is presented to Cosimo as a diplomatic gift by the Venetians, and Cosimo is portrayed as quite an unwilling recipient. Madalena is tasked with spying on him. He only asserts his ownership of her in order to save her from her bad Venetian masters, with whom she will be in trouble if she doesn't do what she's told, that is, seduce and spy on Cosimo. Now, the problem, again, with this in terms of the real history is that there's no evidence whatsoever that anybody in the Medici family was a reluctant owner of enslaved people. In all probability, Madalena was in fact purchased by Cosimo's agent to be a domestic slave, and I think the way that her storyline has been portrayed rather glosses over some of the reality of Europe's slave-owning past, a topic with which I deal in my own book, and which I think one needs to be very cautious about in terms of treatment. But again, this is something where you might say, for dramatic reasons, it is more interesting to have Cosimo in this sort of sympathetic persona where he's torn between the mistress and the wife in this storyline. In fact, however, I think there are sort of bigger considerations in relation to public understanding of the history of slavery that bother me a bit in terms of how this is dealt with. And on this note, in a sense, I kind of have the opposite critique of the TV show to Ottaviano de' Medici. He wants the Medici to have, you know, this nice burnished reputation. I say, I want you to be tougher about how they were bad slave owners. And, you know, the thing about viewing historical accuracy in terms of modern-day ethics is that, of course, what you think about it depends on your political view of what is important in contemporary society. But I should say on that topic, as with the question of same-sex relationships in Renaissance Florence, there are ample opportunities further down the line, should the writers wish to pick up some of these issues. For example, there is, in the 1450s, this very fascinating individual, whose name we do not know, the African archer portrayed in the chapel of the Medici Palace, probably because of the nature of the painting, the fact it appears to be a portrait of a real individual. Probably this was a real person who lived in Florence at that time, who is an individual who historically one could bring to life, should one wish. Now, that issue, as I say, is particularly close to my heart because my own recent book, The Black Prince of Florence, has dealt with the question of slave ownership in Renaissance Italy, specifically with reference to the suggestion that the mother of the illegitimate Alessandro de' Medici was herself a slave or mixed race or Moorish, all three of which are alleged in different sources. And I want to move now to talk a little bit about how, for me, as a historian writing for a wider public, I am affected by the ways that the Medici are dramatised and portrayed in more popular culture that I write myself. Now, Alessandro, who is here, came to power in Florence through a set of bizarre twists of fate in the early part of the 16th century. He was born around 1511 or 12. He was not formally acknowledged as a member of the Medici family until their last legitimate male heir, Duke Lorenzo, died childless, and the Medici had to turn to the two bastard sons in order to preserve the line. Still, he was not expected to take any significant role in Florentine politics until, due to Clement VII becoming severely ill and believing he was going to die at a time when the family were out of power in Florence and only held power in Rome, the preferred candidate for rulership of Florence was made a cardinal instead, leaving Alessandro to step up and step in. It's a fairly complicated story, I won't go into it. I mean, I think the important thing to say is that his rise to power was not at all expected and should not be read, as some people have in the past read it, as there was no problem with illegitimate children of slaves reaching high office in the 16th century. I think there were problems. I think this was really an extraordinary set of circumstances. So I wrote, way back when I was beginning on this project, as a pitch to a publisher, a prologue for this book. And what amused me reading, then looking at all these other texts that dealt with the history of the Medici, was that I had done exactly the sort of thing that one always does in drama and in popular fiction, which is I had started with a murder. I had started on the eve of Epiphany 1537, a night of the most dazzling moonlight. I said I did not make up the dazzling moonlight, that is in a historical source. So I mashed up the historical sources a bit, but this is all about from the historical sources. Alessandro de' Medici, Duke of Florence, had an assignation. His cousin Lorenzino, little Lorenzo, had promised him the favours of Caterina de' Ginori. Alessandro's enemies called Lorenzino his pimp. Now, again, that's in historical sources. I haven't made it up. But what I have done is I did a patch together, mainly based on one historical account of the murder, supposedly from eyewitness evidence, but also from several others to add in details. I begin with an account of Alessandro being murdered by his cousin. And I do that because it's a very classic narrative method of writing. You begin with the narrative hook, the thing that is going to make the casual reader who picks this book up in a bookshop and says, oh, what happens in this book? Oh, it begins with a murder. Isn't that exciting? You know, you do it for those reasons. But actually, once you're a historian writing in this popular mode, you start to borrow, you start to get into a dialogue with other types of writing, specifically with fiction writing. And I begin with that. I then go on, however, to rather put my historian hat on again, and I write some more, the second part of the introduction. It was the misfortune of Alessandro Medici, I write, to be assassinated twice, first with a sword, then with a pen. Thanks to Lauren Xenas and to the many enemies of the Medici family, Alessandro has gone down in history as a tyrant. Not only did Lauren Xenas murder the Duke, he wrote an eloquent justification of his actions. He found, too, a sympathetic interviewer in Benedetto Varchi, the historian who later prepared an account of Alessandro's years on the commission of Cosimo I, Alessandro's successor as Duke. I will recount this death, about which there are various tales and reports with greater truth, wrote Varchi, having heard it from Lorenzo himself and from his accomplice. Although the first reports of Alessandro's death were matter of fact, Varchi's story of Lorenzino's dramatic tyrannicide grips the imagination. The most famous accounts of Alessandro begin with his tales of wickedness in all its bloody glory. His murder, wrote his assassin, was a deed incumbent on any good citizen. He was a tyrant, like Nero, Caligula, or Phalaris. He was a monster, driven by his innate cruelty and savagery. What do those words allude to? It has long been said that Alessandro was the son of a Moorish slave or a half-Negro woman. Were Lauren Xenas' words a racial insult? The answer is not straightforward. And I go on to explain, in fact, some of what the points that Tom was making in the introduction, that the ethnic and religious picture of the 16th century Italy was in fact quite different from the picture that we see today, that the modern idea of race does not fit in to this historical narrative. But I also then go on in the introduction to tie this back to the way that the city of Florence has been mythologized as the symbolic heart of European culture, the cradle of Renaissance civilization. It abounds with the images and stories of great men, Dante, Botticelli, Lorenzo de' Medici, Michelangelo, Galileo. The Renaissance was the first period, so the traditional history went, in which we could truly speak of the great individual, of the Renaissance man. Alessandro's story reminds us that Renaissance men may not always have been white. Alongside the art and poetry, the scheming, intriguing, bloody side of Renaissance politics is well known too. As Orson Welles famously riffed, in Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. To terror, murder, and bloodshed, Alessandro's story adds slavery and the seeds of racism. So in some, with my storytelling, my history, what you get something that you probably expect if you buy a book about the Italian Renaissance, which is a certain degree of murderous intrigue. And, although I was saying in relation to the 15th century Medici that the evidence for murder is really rather slim, with the exception of the Pazzi conspiracy. That is not true in the 16th century, when there is a brief period when there is a vicious internal family rivalry that not only does for Alessandro, but one of his cousins as well. So you get this murderous Renaissance intrigue. The book is structured so as to deliver some suspense about how it's all going to work out. But you also get the thing that publishers and marketing people like, which is a fresh take. You get something slightly different. This is partly familiar in terms of what you're going to read, but it is also does something new, which is to deal in this popular format with the questions about race and ethnicity. I find it really fascinating to look at the way that my historical work on this biography is being marketed, and how different this is from the way that one talks about academic historical research. So when you, this is the paperback cover, which you're just making at the moment. as you see at the top here is the spectacular, elegant, brilliant portrait of skullduggery, murder and sex in Renaissance Florence. I mean, this is what is perceived to sell. You know, there's been discussion about which of these quotations you put on the front. Put Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's a writer of both history and fiction, saying it. Obviously, we have Hilary Mantel, who's a very prominent novelist, but a novelist, not a historian. This book is not primarily being sold on its excellent research or decent research, whatever you call it. But, you know, there's some mention of that. But actually the point is, we're not selling this book to you on the basis that this is, you know, important, significant, groundbreaking, or any of those kind of terms that typically are applied in the academic world to what history does. This is going to be gripping and exciting, and there's going to be skullduggery, murder and sex. So this is, you know, that historians, as soon as we sort of step out of the university world and start talking to the public more widely, you get pulled into this set of terminologies, this set of judgments about how you do popular portrayals of the Renaissance, which have a very different set of values to them than the sort of things you deal with in academic life. In a final part of my talk, I want to introduce two pieces of fiction that I think offer interesting perspectives on and reversions of this period of history. One novel and one TV reboot of a novel. Both take sideways looks at people and events from Medici history and use them to do very interesting things. The first of them is this book, Memoirs, the Gnostic Dwarf, published in 1995. And the easiest way to give you a sense of what this book is like, I think, is to read the opening paragraph. Not quite the opening paragraph, because it begins with one of those prologues that, rather in the style of Umberto Eco, this purports to be a real-life memoir which the author has merely translated after digging it up from some archive. And so he begins. So these are supposed to be the memoirs of a dwarf who serves Leo X somewhat in his role as court jester, if you like. And it begins, 1518. This morning, His Holiness summoned me to read to him from St. Augustine, while the physician applied unguents and salves to his suppurating arse. One in particular, which was apparently concocted from virgin's piss. Where did they find a virgin in Rome, and a rare herb from the private hortus siccus of Bone de Latis, the Pope's Jewish physician-in-chief, stank abominably. Still, it was no worse than the nauseating stench of the festering pustules and weeping ulcers adorning His Holiness's silicious posterior. Everybody refers to these repulsive afflictions as a fistula, but I am not constrained by the self-interest of tact. With his alb pulled up over his hips and his underdrawers down around his ankles, the most powerful man in the world lay sprawled on his bed like a catamite, waiting to be well and truly buggered. He has been buggered plenty of times, hence the state of his arse. Now, that, I think, is not a portrayal of Pope Leo X that one will see on Rai Uno anytime soon. It is, nonetheless, the whole book is quite outrageous and quite fun, and it's also quite self-consciously Rabelaisian in style. It draws on a set of tropes from popular writing in the 16th century, which is to be highly offensive and scabrous and outrageous in its imagery. So it not only uses the historical facts of Leo's papacy, but it also draws on the literature of this period. And it tells a part of history that is not widely told in popular format, in part because of difficulties of the sources. The dwarf Giuseppe of the narrative is a heretic. He's a member of an underground Gnostic sect. The basis of their heresy is that the world we live in Renaissance Rome is made by the devil and not by God. And we follow him through arrest by inquisitors, through a scene of torture of a fellow heretic. He then escapes, he joins a freak show, he goes back to the Gnostics, he works his way into the court of Pope Leo X. And the whole thing, in fairly outrageous fashion, works up a very, very vivid portrait of the Roman underworld, told by piecing together lots of material from lots of different historical sources from the point of view of a person who may well have existed, who could plausibly, up to a point, have existed, but for whom there are almost never any first-person historical sources, because the only occasions, really, when we get first-person historical sources for anybody not of the Renaissance elite is when they get into trouble with the criminal authorities. That's when you get, some of the classics of Italian history, like The Cheese and the Worms, the story, Carlo Ginzburg's great history of the Mille Menocchio, but such rich historical sets of documents are few and far between. And here, fiction, in a way, allows the telling of a story that is often not told, because historical biography tends, by its nature, including the historical biography I've written myself, to focus on either the great men or people, at least, of the second rank. So I think what that book makes me reflect upon is the fact that sometimes, through fictional portrayals of the past, it is possible to tell a set of truths, in some ways, about history that straightforward, source-based historical narrative does not convey very well. That would be one thought of mine on this text. The second example I have for you is very different, but it is also a piece of fiction that says interesting things about what the Renaissance is. This is the recent 3-season TV show Hannibal, and in particular its 3rd season. So for people who are not familiar with this show, I'm not sure to what extent it's had an extensive airing in Italy. This is a TV show focused on the character Hannibal Lecter, who is a serial killer who has previously been featured in a number of films, including Red Dragon and Manhunter, which tell the same story in 2 different, very different styles. The Silence of the Lambs, which is probably the most famous of the original films. There's a film called Hannibal. There's a 4th film called Hannibal Rising, but there's a whole set of adaptations already of this work. Of the books that it's based on, this is the one here, the 3rd book of the trilogy that deals with the Florentine plot. On the cover, this device is actually not from any Florentine heraldry. It's the arms of the Visconti family of Milan that has been appropriated, a Renaissance set of arms for the cover of the book, which is not an accident. So, in the book, and in the TV show, Hannibal, the cannibal, murders people who are rude and eats them for dinner. For gourmet dinner, I should stress, this is all about civility, politeness, and is thoroughly against vulgarity. This story plays through a number of different settings, which I won't go into, but when we hit season 3 of the TV version, it establishes its eponymous protagonist. in a plot that draws heavily on the Patsy conspiracy of 1478. Hannibal is being hunted down by an Italian police officer, a commendatore Patsy, who is a patsy of the patsy. And what this plot does is it situates serial killer guy here, admittedly serial killer with superb artistic and philosophical taste, being conspired against by the patsy, i.e. Hannibal Lecter has become Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici in this story. And this is a really entertaining take, in my view, on this period of history. Because what it does is it both uses and sort of subverts, to some extent, a whole set of tropes about what Renaissance history is like. I've been telling you, Renaissance history, it's all about murder and intrigue. It's about great art. These meals are beautiful. So are the paintings. So is everything that's going on. So in fact, is the whole TV show. It is one of the most beautifully shot TV series that I have seen. And like Medici Masters of Florence, it plays in this sort of Renaissance land, but in a quite strange and lateral and creative way. So we get Hannibal Lecter giving us a lecture on Dante and on motifs of eating in Dante. We get murders as a work of art. We actually get murders in the style of Botticelli, which fits very nicely with the 1478 Patsy conspiracy timing. We get, in fact, you also see it to a lesser extent in some of the earlier film versions. In Silence of the Lambs, there are sketches of Florence on Hannibal Lecter's cell wall. And probably the ultimate joke is the name Clarice Starling, who is, in Silence of the Lambs, the police officer who has a sort of rather twisted relationship with the imprisoned Hannibal Lecter. In real life, Clarice Orsini is the name of Lorenzo the Magnificent's wife. And the Clarice name joke, again, is a Renaissance reference. Now, I don't know how many viewers of this show get all the Renaissance jokes, rather few, I imagine, but I think, what they do is that there is enough there about Florence, about the past. They explain enough of the jokes to create a sense that here we have this lovely sheen of civility and civilization, and underneath it, we have murder. Elegant murder, beautiful murder, but murder nonetheless. And in doing that, it makes quite a witty comment, I think, on a key piece of the history of Western civilization. You see there's a shot from filming where you see lead character with the Medici arms there hidden behind these railings. I'm also amused to note, as I was thinking about my critiques of Medici Masters of Florence, that one of the things that this series has that historical drama does not is it has at its heart a male friendship that by the end of the run is fairly explicitly homoerotic. Again, very appropriate to the Renaissance playful context. So let me conclude with some thoughts about history on page and screen. If I had to come up with rules for how to think about doing history, doing the past in popular culture, I think I would say this. First of all, I would say avoid pedantry. There is nothing more irritating to me than endless questions about, is X accurate, is that accurate? Sometimes, that question can be interesting, but I think we also need to accept that the past is out there as a sort of source to be mined in all sorts of creative projects, and that saying, well, there must be tight limits as to how people do that isn't very helpful, and perhaps isn't the most useful way of engaging. Second, I would say that while the idea of true and false invention? Is your narrative broadly consonant with what really happened in the past, or isn't it? Is interesting and helpful up to a point. It has its limits, particularly in cases where there simply isn't a good historical record, or there are good historical sources but historians disagree on how to interpret them, or when your filmmakers are playing at anachronism and are taking a more creative approach to their historical drama. Third, I think that narratives that don't fit the facts, or don't fit all of them, or don't really try to fit the facts, can still say fascinating things about the past, can still make us ask questions, and can still inspire people to go out, to read more, to think about this world and what went before, and what it might tell us about life today. But I also think that creative decisions to deviate from the historical record are not without their ethical dilemmas. Dilemmas because what we say about the past in a present-day world is inevitably going to reflect on how is inevitably going to be read by people with reference to what is happening around them at the time. And that can happen even without filmmakers intending it. As Tom mentioned at the introduction, I did some work as a historical advisor to the TV adaptation of Wolf Hall. People who have seen Wolf Hall, which is set in early 16th century England, will know that there is a scene in it where some heretics are burnt alive, burnt at the stake. And as it happened, which the filmmakers could not have known, that scene was transmitted within a couple of days of an example, a real-life case of an ISIS prisoner being set alight. And of course, when people saw that historical film, the historical TV drama, they thought about it and they talked about it in terms of what was happening right then in the present day as it was being broadcast. So historical drama, I think, can never be only about history. It is always going to be perceived by people who are living in the time when we are watching it and in relation to what is happening now in the world. That means that it is as much about the present as it is about the past. And that, I think, is where any ethics of historical accuracy needs to start from. Thanks very much.